struggling single mom apologized for bringing her son on a blind date. Sarah's hands trembled as she checked her phone for the third time in 5 minutes. The babysitter had cancelled at the last moment, and now she sat in the upscale restaurant with her 8-year-old son, Tommy, watching the clock tick towards 7 p.m. She had spent her last $20 on this outfit from a thrift store, hoping tonight might change everything. Little did she know it would, but not in the way she expected. If this story touches your heart, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Trillionaire in Love for more inspiring stories like this one. The restaurant's ambient lighting cast golden shadows across the white tablecloths, making Sarah feel even more out of place. She had met David online 3 weeks ago, and their conversations had been wonderful, intelligent, funny, and surprisingly deep. He worked in business, he'd said vaguely, and something about his profile photos suggested success. Now as she sat with Tommy coloring on napkins beside her, she felt the crushing weight of her reality. "Mommy, are we waiting for your friend?" Tommy asked, looking up with his father's green eyes, the same eyes that had once promised forever before walking out when life got difficult. "Yes, sweetheart." "He should be here soon," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the restaurant's soft jazz music. At exactly 7 p.m., a man in an impeccably tailored navy suit approached their table. David Martinez was even more handsome in person, with kind brown eyes and a warm smile that seemed to light up his entire face. But as his gaze shifted from Sarah to Tommy, she watched that smile falter for just a moment and her heart sank. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice uncertain. She stood quickly, nearly knocking over her water glass. "David, I am so sorry. My babysitter cancelled at the last minute, and I couldn't afford another one, and I should have called to reschedule. But I was afraid you'd think I was making excuses." "And, Mom," Tommy interrupted gently, tugging at her dress, "you're talking really fast again." David's expression softened as he watched the interaction. Instead of the anger or disappointment Sarah expected, he simply smiled and extended his hand to Tommy. "Hi there. I'm David. You must be Tommy." Tommy shook his hand solemnly. "I'm 8. Are you going to marry my mom?" Sarah's face burned red. "Tommy, we don't ask questions like that." But David laughed, a genuine warm sound that seemed to fill the entire restaurant. "Well, Tommy, I think your mom and I should probably finish dinner first, don't you think?" As they sat down, Sarah couldn't stop apologizing. "I know this isn't what you signed up for. I completely understand if you want to leave. I can pay for your drink and—" "Sarah," David said gently, placing his hand over hers. "Breathe!" "It's okay." Throughout dinner, something magical happened. David didn't just tolerate Tommy's presence. He engaged with him completely. He listened to Tommy's stories about school, asked about his favorite subjects, and even helped him with a math problem from his homework. When Tommy proudly showed David his drawings, David examined each one with the seriousness of an art critic. "This one of the dragon is incredible," David said, holding up Tommy's napkin artwork. "Did you know that in some cultures, dragons are considered symbols of good luck and protection?" Tommy's eyes widened. "Really, I didn't know that." Sarah watched in amazement. In 3 years of single motherhood, she had never seen a man interact with her son so naturally, so genuinely. Most men she'd briefly dated had seen Tommy as an inconvenience, a barrier to what they really wanted. But David seemed to see him as a person worthy of respect and attention. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in months. David ordered Tommy's favorite, chicken fingers and fries, without being asked. And when Tommy spilled ketchup on his shirt, David simply handed him his own napkin without missing a beat in their conversation about dinosaurs. "What's your job, Mr. David?" Tommy asked as he munched on a French fry. David smiled. "I help run a company that makes sure families have good places to live." It was a simple explanation, and Sarah appreciated how he spoke to Tommy without condescension. What she didn't know was that David Martinez was the CEO of Martinez Development Group, one of the largest real estate companies on the West Coast, worth over $200 million. As they waited for dessert, Tommy excused himself to use the bathroom, leaving Sarah and David alone for the first time all evening. "I'm mortified," Sarah said, burying her face in her hands. "This has to be the worst first date in history." David reached across the table and gently pulled her hands away from her face. "Sarah, look at me!" She raised her eyes to meet his, expecting to see polite disappointment. Instead, she saw something that took her breath away. Genuine admiration. "This has been the best first date I've ever had," he said quietly. "You're just being kind." "No, I'm being honest." "Do you know what I see when I look at you tonight?" Sarah shook her head, afraid to hope. "I see a woman who's so devoted to her son that she'd rather bring him on a date than leave him with someone she doesn't trust completely. I see someone who works so hard that her hands have calluses, yes, I noticed, but who still finds time to help with homework and encourage creativity. I see someone who apologizes for being real, for being human, for having responsibilities that matter more than impressing a stranger." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "David, I see someone beautiful inside and out, and I see a little boy who's polite, intelligent and kind because his mother is raising him right even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." When Tommy returned, chattering about the fancy soap dispensers in the bathroom, David had already made a decision that would change all their lives. Over the next several weeks, David became a fixture in their small world. He showed up to Tommy's soccer games, helped with weekend grocery shopping, and even taught Tommy how to tie his shoes properly. Sarah kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for David to realize that dating a single mother was more work than he'd bargained for. But it never happened. One evening, as they walked through the park after dinner, Tommy ran ahead to play on the swings. Sarah and David sat on a bench watching him play. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said quietly. "Anything. Why? Why didn't you run when you saw Tommy that first night?" "Most men would have." David was quiet for a long moment. "My father left when I was 7, he said finally. "I know what it's like to watch your mom struggle, to see her choose between paying rent and buying groceries, to feel like you're the reason she can't have nice things or go out with friends." Sarah's heart ached for the little boy he'd been. "I also know what it's like to watch your mom sacrifice everything for you and still somehow make you feel loved and valued. Tommy has that same confidence, that same security. He knows he's loved completely. That doesn't happen by accident, Sarah. That's because of you. But you're successful, accomplished. You could have anyone. I don't want anyone. I want you. Both of you." It was then that Sarah learned the truth about David's wealth, about his company, about the fact that he could afford to take care of them both without thinking twice about money. But what amazed her wasn't his financial success. It was that he'd never once made her feel small because of her struggles. 6 months later, David proposed in the same restaurant where they'd met, with Tommy's full approval and participation in the planning. When Sarah said yes, Tommy cheered so loudly that the entire restaurant applauded. Their wedding was simple but perfect, held in David's backyard with just close friends and family. During his speech, David looked at Tommy and said, "I'm not trying to replace your father. I'm just hoping to be the dad you deserve." Tommy, now 9 and much more articulate, stood up and said, "You already are." 3 years later, Sarah couldn't believe how much their lives had changed. David had quietly paid off all her debts, but more importantly, he'd never made her feel like a charity case. He'd supported her dreams, helping her finish her nursing degree while he took care of Tommy after school. They'd built a family based on respect, love, and the understanding that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most unexpected places. The challenges hadn't disappeared overnight. Sarah had struggled with feeling worthy of David's love, with the fear that she was somehow taking advantage of his kindness. There were moments when she felt overwhelmed by the difference in their backgrounds, when imposter syndrome crept in at company events or family gatherings. David had been patient through it all, consistently showing her that her worth wasn't measured by her bank account or her past struggles, but by her character, her strength, and her heart. He'd insisted on couples counseling, not because they had problems, but because he wanted to make sure they had the tools to communicate effectively as their family grew. Tommy, now 12, had flourished with a stable father figure in his life. His grades improved, his confidence soared, and he'd developed a passion for architecture inspired by David's work. The three of them had become a team in the truest sense of the word. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table in their warm, comfortable home, Tommy looked up from his homework. "Dad," he said to David, "do you ever think about that first night when Mom brought me on your date?" David smiled. reaching over to ruffle Tommy's hair. "Every day, buddy. Best thing that ever happened to me was your mum being too good a mother to leave you with someone she didn't trust." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes as she looked around the table at her family. Her real, beautiful, imperfect, perfect family. What would have happened if the babysitter hadn't cancelled? Tommy asked curiously. David and Sarah exchanged a look. They'd talked about this many times over the years. "I think I still would have fallen in love with your mum," David said thoughtfully. "But it might have taken longer to realize that you were part of the package, and honestly, you're the best part." That night, as they tucked Tommy into bed, he looked up at both of them and said, "I'm glad I went on that date with you guys." "Me too." "Sweetheart," Sarah whispered, kissing his forehead. "Me too." Later, as Sarah and David sat on their porch swing watching the stars, Sarah reflected on how far they'd come. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been so desperate that night?" she asked. David pulled her closer. "I don't think it was desperation, Sarah. I think it was love. You loved Tommy so much that you were willing to risk embarrassing yourself rather than compromise his safety. That's not desperation. That's the kind of love that changes the world." As they sat in comfortable silence, Sarah realized that sometimes the moments we think will ruin everything are actually the moments that save us. That night in the restaurant, when she'd felt like her world was falling apart, had actually been the night it all came together. Her struggles as a single mother hadn't ended that night, but they had led her to a man who saw strength where others saw burden, who saw beauty where others saw chaos, and who saw family where others saw complications. The little boy who had colored on napkins and asked innocent questions about marriage was now a young man who understood that love wasn't always convenient, but it was always worth it. He'd learned that families come in all shapes and sizes, and that sometimes the people who choose to love you are just as important as the people who are supposed to. This story reminds us that our struggles don't disqualify us from love. They prepare us for the right kind of love. If this touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment telling us about a time when something you thought was a disaster turned into a blessing. And subscribe to Trillionaire in Love for more stories that celebrate the beautiful, messy, miraculous nature of real love. Remember, sometimes what we think will ruin everything is exactly what saves us.